This is Wayman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.
Welcome back to another edition of Inside the News. This is our domestic segment, and we're glad to have you listening, whether by radio with the affiliates or online at YouTube. Frank, let's get started right away with you. Congress seems to be stymied by the Democrats and the GOP. Even their own party just seems to kind of keep them at bay. McConnell and Ryan, they're not doing their job, Frank.
Well, certainly when it comes to health care legislation, one of the most significant issues during the 2016 campaign was the repeal of the failed Obamacare, and indeed it did fail by almost every measure. It was expected that one of the first things that would be done would be the repeal of Obamacare, which is something that really hasn't been tried. Rather than simply repeal Obamacare, go back to the status quo ante, and try to resolve the issues that did affect American health care before Obamacare, the Republican method has been to tie in Obamacare repeal with a whole new health care package, and that's provided the problem. Now, right now, it seems there's some movement forward in separating the two, in first repealing Obamacare and then worrying about the effects of what should replace it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that if you repeal Obamacare that it's going to go back to the status quo ante on day one. The repealer could always have an effective date, say 12 months to 18 months from now, which would allow Congress more time to come up with a compromise bill of what would actually go back and solve the problems that prompted Obamacare to be passed in the first place. Things like covering the uninsured or your coverage till age 26 for children. Those things could be done in a more rational way if Obamacare was simply totally repealed with a repeal effective date, say, of a year to 18 months from now, again, giving Congress the ability to come up with a more well-thought-out, rational plan to replace it.
Okay, Ben, healthcare and this Obamacare is a mess. And when you start to look at it, it seems like it's more like it was an insurance plan by the federal government rather than trying to reduce healthcare. If they were going to reduce healthcare, they would have looked at all the elements that brought into that. But this is just an insurance bill, wasn't it?
Well, it was a social engineering experiment is what it was. It was an attempt to cover people who have chronic diseases that are uncoverable in a free market system because they cost so much money. There's no way to profitably cover the 5% of the population that has chronic illnesses. It was an attempt to do that and to pay for it by forcing young people who are very profitable to cover to purchase insurance at a price that was a very profitable price for the private sector. Unfortunately, the forcing part has not worked because the penalties imposed on young people for not buying insurance is less than the cost of insurance in most cases. So most young people are not buying. And the whole theory has collapsed as a result, and it is wreaking havoc on the private insurance sector as a result of this failed theory. So we are left with a collapsing private insurance marketplace and very conflicting desires on the part of most senators on where to go. The problem with repealing this, and it is very tempting to just repeal because the votes, I think, probably might be there, although not necessarily in the Senate. I have my doubts about that. But let's say we did it and you had a 2-year sunset. The problem is it forces the Democrats back to the table in the Senate because any replacement will require 60 votes in the Senate. And we're going to be left with a new replacement system that is driven by the Democrats in the Senate. And that's the reality if you go that route. And in the meantime, the press will absolutely vilify the Republicans for any repealing of the system. You will see nonstop stories of all the people who used to have health care coverage who no longer have, and as a result, poor Susie Jones can no longer get her cancer treatment, and she's going to die as a result. That's the story you're going to see every night on the press if it gets repealed without some type of replacement. So the Republicans are in a quandary. You look at the Republican senators, and a good portion of them, frankly, are big government Republicans who want to see the replacement look a lot like Obamacare. And what was close to passing, from what I can gather, and looking at the legislation that was on the table, was really Obamacare with a little bit more states' rights attached to it. But we were funding Medicare and Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion, which has been the key issue, the key way to cover people who are chronically ill under Obamacare. We were funding that. We were just letting states to have a little bit more say in the process so that you could have some divergence between states. I think the reality is the President of the United States has to lead on this issue. If he wants to salvage this issue for the Republicans, and frankly, if they do nothing, it's going to hurt them, I think, quite badly in the upcoming midterm election. If he wants to salvage this issue, he has to decide what he wants legislation to look like, and he has to champion that legislation, and he has to sell it to the American people. He has the capability of doing it. He has been silent on this issue, and he has been sitting back and letting it play its course in Congress with the idea that he'll sign whatever gets through the Republican House and Senate. He needs to lead, and that's where he's fallen short.
You know, Frank, Ben brought up a good point. However, I would not even worry about the media going after me if I'm a Republican, because right now the GOP, they're getting slammed anyways by the media, and they need to do what is right. And it seems like that's what they have forgotten in this whole thing, Frank.
Guy, you're absolutely right. One of the problems is that it is fear that motivates the GOP. One of the reasons why, when the Republicans owned both the House and the Senate during the Obama presidency, they were frightened of doing anything to counter him, was the bad experience, as they saw it, they had from the press when the government was shut down. Now, it takes two to shut down a government. It takes both the legislature and the executive to disagree on any kind of budget bill before the government needs to be shut down. The way the press covered the story, however, was all the GOP's fault. From that and from the resulting kick in the head, frankly, that the GOP took from the media on shutting down the government, the GOP simply decided they were not going to do anything that could provide the press with the opportunity to criticize them. And as Ben expertly points out on the Obamacare bill, that's what's the problem with the GOP this time around. Rather than working for a viable alternative to Obamacare, and let's face it, Obamacare clearly has been a disaster, skyrocketing premiums, skyrocketing deductions. It clearly has to go, and I think most Americans agree with that. All that's motivating the GOP is the fear of how it's going to be covered in the press, and that's a huge problem. I spoke yesterday to one of the leaders of New York State's Conservative Party, a party formed here in New York State, simply because it was felt that the Republican Party was becoming too liberal in the past of her Governor Nelson Rockefeller. And he said, look, no one, even the most ardent conservatives, are not heartless. They're not going to say that, as Ben said before, that Mrs. So-and-so is not going to get her cancer treatment because she can't afford it. But there are ways to do it that make sense and ways to do it that don't make sense. Obamacare was a Rube Goldberg contraption for solving what could have been a simple problem. One of the things this conservative leader mentioned was that even if it came to the point of putting, say, a surtax on existing health care policies and using the funds from that surtax to provide policies for the 5% or so who are totally uninsured or had pre-existing conditions, that would have at least made sense. What we've seen here is a power grab by the federal government to take over 1/6 of the American economy, and the actual provision of health care to those who can't afford it, that was really an afterthought.
It truly was. Ben, you have a comment on that, I know.
Well, look, I always suspected, and I actually wrote articles about this 8 years ago, that the entire point of Obamacare and the way it was set up was it was intended to fail, and in that failure, there would be a demand for a single-payer system, which was the real goal of progressive liberals in Congress at the time. They didn't have the votes to do it outright 7 years ago, so they passed this interim approach, which didn't work economically. So unfortunately, if the Republicans don't come up with a well thought out and reasoned view based on private market, free market principles, and we've talked about a lot of these key principles on this show, getting rid of artificial intrastate barriers, getting rid of the litigation-driven medicine that is driving costs through the roof for a lot of medical services, introducing free market, tort reform to the process. These are the types of things that can drive down cost. If you look at LASIK and laser eye care, which is generally paid for out of pocket by most Americans, you have seen the free market at work over the last 20 years. What was a very expensive procedure 10, 15, 20 years ago has become a reasonably inexpensive procedure, and the technology is much better. Now, the results are much better than they were 20 years ago. So that is the free market at work. It works in every instance it's applied. And yet in our medical industry, in so many ways, we have protected marketplaces, monopoly rules that keep competition from flourishing and driving down the cost. And the result is what we have today.
Frank, I'm going to say out something here and kind of work with me on this. We saw Al-Qaeda plan the 9/11 attack, and they were willing to be patient and plan it way out in advance. Well, it was 8 or 9 years ago when this health care bill, Obamacare, that was planned out. And what Ben said really rings true is that they were willing to bide their time and be patient, knowing that in 9 years it was all going to collapse and it was all going to come to fruition now for that demand of single payer system because it's already in the pipeline, Frank.
Well, that's precisely correct. And part of the problem we're facing right now is similar to what a member of the European Parliament, Daniel Hannan, told me in Washington several years ago. Once a government health care plan gets enacted, it's almost impossible to get rid of it. In the United Kingdom, their National Health Service is extremely unpopular, and yet the government nor the population can find a way to extract themselves from it. The infrastructure of the private sector of healthcare in the United Kingdom, except for a tier of private healthcare that's affordable mostly by the wealthy, it's so entrenched that you just can't get rid of it. And the path from a failed Obamacare system to a single-payer system is absolute and clear. If it occurs, we will never be able to get ourselves out of it, and we'll be stuck with second- or third-class health care for the rest of our lives and the rest of the life of the country. Look, the fact of the matter is people from Europe, people from even the old Soviet Union used to come to the United States for their health care if they could afford it or had the political connections to do it. Leonid Brezhnev, for example, came to the United States in the 1970s to care for his cancer treatment. We're going to lose all that simply because there's a socialist dream of governmentizing 1/6 of the United States economy through a single-payer system.
We have about a minute or so left in this segment, Ben. The Democrats seem to be able to unite together, and it doesn't matter, even if they disagree, they unite. But the GOP always seems to be so idealistic that they splinter themselves apart, and they just can't unite to pass anything, Ben.
Well, this is an example where the core philosophy of each party has advantages and disadvantages. Republicans are free market individuals for the most part, and as a result, they tend not to arm twist and beat up wayward Republicans because they have a great deal of respect for dissenting opinions. The Democrats have always been very good at enforcing the party line upon all Democrats and severely punishing any Democrat who fails to toe that line without permission. They allow wayward votes for political reasons when that wayward vote doesn't matter. But the reality is the Democrats can pull their votes together and keep them in line. It has proven to be a big advantage for the party for a long time, and the Republicans are not capable of doing that because they won't enforce the discipline when someone goes off the reservation.
Well, this is Inside the News, and this is our domestic segment. And Frank Vernuccio, you can find him at usagovpolicy.com. He's the editor-in-chief of the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, the writer and the voice of the syndicated radio feature Minute Report for America. You can find Ben Brunson at benbrunson.com and amazon.com. He wrote 2 books. It's called The False Death Enigma and Esther's Sling. With Frank Vernuccio and Ben Brunson, we'll be back.
You're listening to Wayman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.